This episode uses explicit language, so please be aware of that, especially if any children are nearby. Episode 3, Self-ID and Gender Identity.
Oh, thank God I am home. What a day. Mandy, come here. Never stops. Drama on the Nolan show. That's fried. Is that Mandy? You going to be good?
David, I don't want to say enigma because it sounds like, poetic. David can be a real pain in the arse most of the time. But the reason you put up with that is because he's the best journalist I've met in a long, long time.
The relationship with Nolan sometimes is fraught. We always get on well. We get on very well actually, but it doesn't mean that there's not heated moments. He'll always bring up the day when I, in his words, flounced off and left. There had been some kind of dispute over a story. He and I didn't see eye to eye on it. I'd worked for a long time on it and literally packed up all my stuff and was leaving the BBC that day.
But here's the thing. So Thompson says he was packing all his stuff. I didn't notice any of this because I was exhausted. I was actually lying on the floor in some type of coma at one stage. And I remember looking up to him and saying, "See you tomorrow, mate?" And he smiled at me and said, "All right." So this flounce of his, it was just like it was momentary, as most of his are.
He's never let me live it down. But I'm not like that most of the time. Most of the time I'm the rational, sane one, I think.
Why is he a pain in the arse? Because he's weird and he's aloof. And, he's really, really loyal to me. But would he go a walk with me up the street? Would he? Hell. He would tell me his granny's pregnant every month, every time I say, "Here, you want to go on a walk?" And yet he would sit up all night working. So he's a kind of very private individual.
Mandy? Come on. He's currently down at Fantasy Island, as he calls it, this amazing house on Strangford Lough, and it overlooks an area of outstanding natural beauty. And he's on this never-ending diet. So the thing is, he's got this beautiful place and all this equipment, but he's 20 stone. If he would stop eating the crisps and the burgers and the McFlurries, he wouldn't need all this equipment and need to be on this diet his whole life, because it's clearly not working. So Nolan is absolutely plaguing me today about the podcast because he has so many questions that he wants answered. Oh, here we go. Yes.
I'm trying again on the treadmill. How can such a fat man actually be still fat? How is it possible, Thompson?
What number attempt is this?
No, but tell me seriously. I keep on trying and then give it up. So here we are again. It's a beautiful day right here.
Are you just looking for a life coach, or what's up?
I'm obsessed with this podcast. What is self-ID?
Self-ID?
Yes.
Self-ID is basically, so at the minute, if you want to change your sex, you have to go through a process and you have to meet certain criteria to be accepted and change your sex.
That's transgender, right?
Well, yeah, some transgender people go through that process. If they want to change their sex and be legally recognised as a different sex, they go through a process. You don't have to have, medical procedures or anything. Are you okay? You basically have to live in the other sex, and then you can get a certificate. So that's what happens at the moment.
Right, so that's someone who goes to their doctor and they go through a whole process and there's consultation and all that. Yeah. Right, so how does that compare to self-ID?
Oh, okay, so self-ID is basically the policy that groups like Stonewall would advocate for, which is that it's really up to that person. It's how they declare themselves.
This is from GLAAD's YouTube page. GLAAD is the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, a US-based LGBT rights group.
I love being trans because I'm not forced to be in a box where I don't belong.
People spend their entire lives figuring out who they are. We do it, and then we can teach that to the rest of the world.
I've been able to create my own narrative, tell my own story, and not have to subscribe to other people's ideas of normal or other people's ideas of beauty.
Now, you might have to fill out a declaration or something to say, I'm now a different sex to the sex I was born, or a different gender to the gender you were born into, which basically would mean it's much more down to the individual. It's about them living in the gender that they feel most comfortable with.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, critics of that would say that it undermines sex-based rights. So there are protections in the Equality Act and in law about single-sex spaces, for example. So, female changing rooms or like women's refuges, that type of stuff where...
You see, to be fair to Stonewall, like, why does everything always come down to changing rooms? Like, do people think that people are, constantly obsessed with seeing nudity? They can go to the internet for that. I very much doubt that somebody's going to, go through this whole process just to get into a changing room to see somebody's genitals.
What the critics would say is that it's not about genuine trans people, but if you don't have that process, then you don't have anything in place to stop people who want to abuse that system. So they're worried about sexual predators, for example, or men who are violent towards women using women's refuges. I don't think the critical groups are saying, you just shouldn't do this, it's not right, you can't just self-ID a different gender. What a lot of the groups like Fair Play for Women are saying is that there needs to be certain protections, and you need to have single-sex spaces. That needs to be protected. That's legally protected already, and that needs to stay the same. And if you change this, that would undermine that.
The following is a report from CBS Los Angeles from the 4th of July, 2021.
Violent clashes between demonstrators and the LAPD. These demonstrators showed up to support trans rights and We Spa, a business that came under fire this week over a viral video.
It's okay for a man to go into the women's section, show his penis around the other women, young little girls underage.
So, Thompson, there was a huge row, wasn't there, in LA over this, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a social media storm over reports of a man, or maybe a trans woman, who went into a changing room that was reserved for women. And the law in that part of America actually protects people's gender expression.
In LA, does it?
Yeah, in LA.
So someone who was biologically male went into a female changing room, is that right?
Yeah, seemingly they were physically male. They took their clothes off, and some of the women there were angry about this. There were claims that there were children there, and some of the women didn't think it was appropriate. It became this focal point for this huge row over trans rights, and there were police there, protesters for and against trans rights. There were women who were saying this is a space for women and only women should be allowed here.
Okay, no, I'm not one. Actually, I'm a woman who knows how to stand up and speak up for my right. As a woman, I have a right to feel comfortable without a man exposing himself, okay?
Well, this person would maybe say they are a woman.
They might, and that's what this debate all comes down to. Can someone just say, I'm a woman, this
Why,
is
there's
how
a
I
big
feel,
penis hanging there.
and this is how I express myself?
Big or small penis hanging there.
Exactly. Some people will say you can never change that, you're still a man, and that's what it comes down to.
LAPD declared unlawful assembly, and officers in tactical gear ushered the crowd off the street.
Since we recorded this section, there's been a debate over the accuracy of the initial reports. Some news organisations cast doubt on the veracity of the story. The Guardian reported in an article about misinformation around the incident that the unsubstantiated allegations about We Spa, quote, quickly spread from social media to right-wing forums to far-right news sites to Fox News and were distorted by anti-transgender groups across multiple countries. The Guardian also reported that, quote, it is unclear whether a trans woman was actually present, and said that, quote, a local LGBTQ plus paper reported that a spa employee said there were no trans patrons with appointments that day, leading some to question whether the incident was staged. Then, subsequently, The Guardian reported that, quote, the LA Police Department announced that it had put out an arrest warrant for an individual who is now facing 5 felony counts of indecent exposure at We Spa. The Guardian also reported that LAPD said that 5 individuals had come forward and that the police service had conducted interviews of victims and witnesses, reviewed the evidence and ultimately corroborated the allegations of indecent exposure. They report that the individual's gender identity was also unclear.
The New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard is set to become the first transgender athlete to compete at the Olympics.
So, for example, there's a row over trans athletes at the Olympics, like the weightlifter Laurel Hubbard. There are really strict and complex rules, and Laurel had to prove that her testosterone was below a certain level because testosterone increases your muscle mass. Critics say if you could just self-ID, you could have self-identifying trans women playing sport on what many other women say would be an uneven playing field.
She was competing in men's events until she transitioned in 2012.
But self-ID isn't just about someone that's a man saying they're a woman or a woman saying they're a man. That's where all this cis stuff and genderqueer, what is it?
Well, there's different genders, and how they fit into that, people don't really know. I mean, we've seen the Stonewall lobbying for those gender identities to be recognised by public bodies. So if you're gender fluid, for example, you might consider yourself, a man one day, a woman on a different day, or you might be somewhere in between and say that you're not either. And they're asking for public bodies to formally recognise that. So self-ID and the discussions in the Scottish Parliament and elsewhere about a self-ID policy is much more related to people that are actually changing their sex or want to be recognised as a different, either male to female or female to male. But quite where those different gender identities that Stonewall lobby on behalf of fit into that, nobody...
Now, as you're all listening from home or wherever it is you're listening to this podcast, you might remember Piers Morgan causing a huge controversy around this type of territory.
I'm actually a two-spirit, neutroid, pangender penguin. And how dare you tell me I can't identify as that?
Give me an example of some of those identities.
You could be genderqueer, you could be non-binary, you could be two-spirit. These are some of the
two-spirit?
I think it comes from a Native American idea of people who are basically neither male nor female, or they may have both. I mean, some of these terms are not defined. There's not a dictionary definition of them. So it's really what interpretation people put on those themselves.
I've heard of them. I don't really know what they all mean. But, I mean, whatever makes you happy, Yeah, I'm fairly aware of them. I have a few friends, and even my own brother is trans, so I feel like society should always accommodate to make people feel more comfortable.
Sometimes you can feel a lot more masculine than feminine. Other days you can feel a lot more feminine than masculine. I just don't think it really matters, honestly.
I didn't grow up with a lot of LGBT people, so when I found out about, trans rights and everything like that, I found myself and I became more comfortable in my own identity.
I've no non-binary is the only thing I've heard of it. The rest, no.
One of the people we happened to bump into in the street was Father Timothy Bartlett. He's a Catholic priest who's attended Pride events and discussions on LGBT issues in the past. Here's what he had to say.
I've heard of some of those, not all of them. And my starting point, and I think the starting point particularly of anybody in it from a church pastoral perspective, has to be the individual and their particular story, their history, and their understanding of themselves. That's where I always begin, and how they define themselves and articulate their experience of who they are. So to me, that's much more important than approaching anybody with a particular label in mind. If people want to use that as their identifiers, well, I respect that, but I'd want to also understand what they mean by that. And in some of those cases I do, in some of them I don't.
Here's Benjamin Cohen from Pink News again. The identities that people give themselves and identify as, for example, two-spirit, right? I'm a 48-year-old man. I have no idea what two-spirit means. Is there any control over what these definitions mean? Like, what does two-spirit mean, and who decides what is two-spirit and what isn't? And again, without me being facetious, could someone tomorrow say that they're being three-spirit?
I understand your point, that I'm 10 years younger than you. And this is also difficult for, I guess us older people sometimes to navigate because terminology does change. I first heard the term two-spirit when I was at an event with Canada's High Commissioner and Canada's LGBT envoy. And it's a Canadian term, and it's actually from the kind of Native American, it has Native American origins in Canada. So it derives from there.
But what does it mean?
Oh God! You're testing me. I probably couldn't give you the dictionary definition.
But just, can you give me a sense of what it means? So if someone comes to me and says, I'm two-spirit, what does it actually mean?
It's how they're describing themselves.
I know, but surely there needs to be a meaning to these things, or it plays into these people who maybe try to be rude and say they're just making this up as they go along. What does it mean?
It relates to things like the third. It's just like quite complex. I'm no expert in different in cultures that I'm not part of, but it's part of an indigenous culture in North America.
Well, if you take something from the UK, which we use quite often, like genderqueer.
Then what does genderqueer mean?
Genderqueer, I'm more happy to kind of...
But I will say to you, and maybe I haven't given you a tough enough time in this interview, but the fact that the person at the very top of Pink News does not know what, two-spirit means, and I'm supposed to know, and society's supposed to expect it, is surely extraordinary.
We all have a duty to be educating themselves. You have pointed out to me that I can't give you, off the top of my head, a definition of two-spirit that would be considered to be accurate, and I think that accuracy, as... we're all on this call journalists. I believe accuracy is a central part of being... Or
we should be saying to people, you just can't categorise yourself and as all of these different descriptors.
No, I don't agree with that, because I might carry... I'm a Jew, but if I'm having a conversation with different Jewish people, we'll talk about the type of Jews.
Well, maybe it comes down to this, Benjamin, is maybe you can express yourself whatever way you want, but it's a big leap from your personal expression and your personal description of yourself as genderqueer or two-spirit or non-binary to actually dealing with that practically day-to-day in law.
I think an important point is that none of these identities that you're talking about are defined in law. So if what you're saying is there needs to be an official definition of different LGBT plus identities, then that is something for politicians to consider with changes to the Equality Act or things like the Gender Recognition Act, both of which...
And shouldn't Stonewall just lobby for that? Shouldn't they just say, let's change the Equality Act and let's protect...
No, what I'm saying to you is that you said official definitions. There aren't official definitions.
Please, Benjamin, tell me before you go what genderqueer is. I have no notion.
Genderqueer, it means your identity is at variant probably to the gender that you were defined at birth, and different people use different terminology to describe themselves. So some people who describe themselves as genderqueer, some people may describe their feeling as genderqueer, other people may say non-binary or gender non-binary, but queer is also important because they might also be describing their sexual orientation at the same time. So it's complex, and it's not, in my view, it's not for an individual who's not part of that community to define themselves. I define myself as a gay man.
So does that mean you're genderqueer?
No.
Why not? Why are you not genderqueer?
Because my gender is not at variance to the gender which I was assigned at birth.
And who cares what somebody in their own head is thinking they are? Why have they not got the right to think who they are and what they are?
I don't know of any of the critics of Stonewall who have an issue with that. I think where their issue comes is how does a society legislate for this type of stuff? When those sort of identities change, how can an employer, for example, facilitate that? Obviously, Stonewall would say, well, yes, of course they can. They can find different ways of accommodating people with different gender identities. But at the minute, as things stand, sex is binary in law. There's male and there's female. And transgender is recognised. People are protected if they're going through a process of change from male to female or vice versa. But the law has no capacity to deal with
people with different gender identities.
Do public bodies have to accept the different identities? In other words, say somebody was arrested and the police attempt to define them as a man or a woman. Do public bodies have to accept a suspect who says, actually, I'm two-spirit?
Trans has become much more than just sort of someone who's going through a process of transitioning from one sex to another. And by Stonewall's own definition, it includes those various gender identities. It's kind of like an umbrella term. So there's two things. Say, for example, a male commits violence against a female, and that male is going through or intending to go through gender reassignment, the formal process. They're protected on the characteristic of gender reassignment. The old term's transsexual. If somebody essentially, and there have been cases where this has arisen, if someone, for example, a male commits a sexual offence or a violent offence against a woman, and that person has self-identified as a different sex, the police services have accepted that.
From the documents we have seen, self-ID is already effectively in place in many public bodies in the UK. We put it to Labour MP Rosie Duffield that if that's the case, what's the problem?
There's a question of somebody who is having treatment and who really does want to go down the route of gender reassignment surgery and has been suffering for a long time, feeling that they're in the wrong body biologically, and that must be horrendous. I can't imagine what that's like to be a trans person. However, there are also problems if an individual decides that they are male-bodied and yet they identify as a woman, for example. It can obviously go the other way, and therefore they can go into biological women's spaces. There's a lot of women who are incredibly uncomfortable about that, and we haven't legislated for that whole area because basically we haven't had the time to talk about it in Parliament. It just seems to have gone straight to kind of social media discussions and, all about people's rights, but women are really concerned about their biological sex rights. We have safe spaces and protected biological sex spaces for some very serious reasons. And it's not saying by any means that anyone with a male body is a potential pervert or rapist. We have those laws to protect us from the few people that are.
You're defining a safe space for a woman as being male-free.
Yeah, a lot of women who've had direct experience of men using their bodies for harm or to harm them do not want to be anywhere near a male body for some very good reasons. So, for example, domestic abuse is a really obvious one, and, you wouldn't necessarily put your children in a position where they could see adults walking around naked. I mean, we have protection and safeguarding for a reason, but also many women don't believe that just because you feel like a woman, if you've got a male body, it doesn't make you one magically. This is a discussion that we haven't been able to have because we're automatically labelled bigots or transphobes if we say that. And I think it is much more complicated and needs a lot more discussion.
And that absolutely needs more discussion. But I just wonder if you should be challenged more on suggesting that, a safe space is male-free because it is a different sex of person there. You're basically saying that men will be attracted to women and therefore they shouldn't be naked in front of them. How come the country doesn't fall over when in male changing rooms, gay males are allowed into the same changing rooms as heterosexual males? There's attraction there. Nothing, the world doesn't stop. And it's not an unsafe space.
It's not about attraction. I think the crime of rape is a violent crime, and men use their bodies as a weapon in that sense. It's nothing to do with attraction or sexuality even. It's a crime of violence. So if we are put in a position where we are vulnerable to male violence or male-bodied people in our space, I think we have absolutely the right to question that and to say no, actually. And these are our bodies. They're different to male bodies, and we're allowed to say that and to say no. And we've fought for the right to do that. And we are saying no, a lot of us. And, I'll protect my right to say that. So, some people don't like that. But, we've got to have that discussion.
So, you can see the fault lines. This is an important debate which will dictate how society functions in the future. There are people who insist there is only male and female, and then there are those who completely disagree. Fundamentally disagree to such an extent that they believe there are hundreds of genders.
But if you look at the statistics, those numbers are going up.
But how can there be many different genders? How can there be? And who is the body that defines what that gender means, rather than it just being based on whatever somebody wants it to mean. So who has defined, like, we know what a male means. A male means you've got a penis and testicles, doesn't it? So what does...
And male chromosomes and what everyone understands a male to mean.
No, I get that, Thompson. And I get what a female means. But, like, who defines what two-spirit is?
Well, a lot of these things are really about how people define themselves. I take your point. Who defines what that is?
Is Stonewall defining it?
I don't think they do, but they would list that as an example of a different gender identity that some people would feel. You may get back to your treadmill.
Thompson, I hope that we have dubbed the sound of the treadmill under this so that nobody knows I stopped after the beginning. And then they'll think I'm an athlete, that I have been able to calmly, while not even being breathless, speak to you the whole way through.
Speaking as a BBC employee, I would have to say that would be breaching safeguard and trust. The audience need to know the truth.
Do you know what really irritates me about you?
How much bad food you can eat and you're a skinny wee runt?
That's because I work too hard. No comment.
In summary, Stonewall is campaigning to make it a societal norm that rather than just male and female, human beings can have lots more genders, including genderqueer, queer, non-binary, two-spirit, many others. And that is controversial territory. And yet Stonewall's position has infiltrated, guess what? The BBC Children's Education Department.
What are the different gender identities?
That's a really, really exciting question to ask.
Do you know there are so many gender identities? So we know we've got male and female, but there are over 100, if not more, gender identities now.
Stonewall's influence potentially goes beyond issues of impartiality in the BBC. Stonewall also has influence in a number of politically neutral public bodies that affect all of our lives. From the people who gather data for the census, to our governments across the UK and our civil servants. We will look at that. Stonewall seems to have been allowed to position itself as the expert body in equality when it comes to gay, lesbian, bisexual or transgender people. It's as if no other experts on the planet who might disagree with Stonewall exist. Certain groups are protected from discrimination in law based on characteristics like your race, sex or sexual orientation. In other words, you can't be discriminated against because you're black. That law is the Equality Act, and it makes employers responsible for ensuring none of those protected groups are treated unfairly. Here's the Conservative MP, Philip Davies.
The bill introduces the concept of protected characteristics of age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and belief, sex and sexual orientations.
And many employers invited Stonewall in to help them, particularly around gay and trans employees. Stonewall don't think the law goes anywhere near far enough on trans rights. For example, they're thinking that a biological male could decide without any transition process that they should be treated in law as a woman is deeply controversial, and it's opposed bitterly by others. And so far, it has been rejected by the government. So that is just one example of how Stonewall are in very controversial territory. They may be the experts in some people's view, but in others, they may be fundamentally wrong. This is all caught up in the middle of a toxic row over whether your biological sex or how you identify is more important. Opponents say Stonewall advised public bodies on the law as they want it to be, rather than what the law actually is. But despite all this controversy, many public organisations have been treating Stonewall as the experts. What Stonewall says goes. Here's the Conservative MP, David T.C. Davies, speaking in a Westminster Hall debate on self-ID in November 2018.
The point that I'm making is that before any legislation has been passed, we are already seeing organisations such as schools, hospitals and prisons allowing people to define themselves by a different gender to the one that they are born with and in the majority of cases to which their body corresponds. And it does have an impact on others. It has an impact on the rights, particularly of women, to privacy and to sex-segregated spaces.
The changes related to sex and gender that Stonewall would lobby for are not yet and may never be law in this country. But Stonewall's advice has resulted in some bodies basically operating self-ID. Let's hear what Ruth Hunt told Oxford University when she was speaking on behalf of Stonewall.
Stonewall was set up as a non-democratic organisation designed to provide a very professional lobbying organisation, and that pissed people off and always has done.
Stonewall are not accountable for any policy changes that public bodies make. Take Stonewall out of this for a second. Forget about whether you agree with them or not. How worrying is it that there is an unaccountable lobby group, partly funded by you, the public, which has unparalleled access to your government, to your employer, to your police force, to your BBC? Should that concern you? The DUP politician Jim Wells has a history of controversial remarks around LGBT issues.
It's worrying because many people in the country, tens of thousands of people, particularly churchgoers, are depending upon the DUP to hold the line on certain issues.
So a gay person should not be a public representative of the DUP. They shouldn't be seen in public, Jim, is that right?
No, Stephen, a gay person's every right to stand for a political party. But the DUP has a tradition and an ethos on this issue, and that has been broken, and many of our supporters don't like how it's been done. And secondly, it goes against the ethos of so many of our members.
Jim Wells raised the issue of the Northern Ireland Civil Service being a Stonewall diversity champion in Stormont's Finance Committee in 2020.
I think we need to start by finding out a bit more about the relationship between civil service and Stonewall. I don't think it's appropriate that any government agency has a relationship with a very militant, one-sided campaigning group.
In that same meeting, the chair of the committee, then Ulster Unionist Party leader Steve Aiken, gave his understanding of Stonewall.
Just for a matter of disclosure, I'm quite aware of Stonewall's work, and I've worked with Stonewall with sort of the Royal Navy and various other places, and there is a perception that they might be seen as being militant in some places.
Yes, they are.
But in a lot of other places, they're not.
Well, theoretically, what could happen here is that any lobby group who are representing one of the protected characteristics under the Equality Act, be it on the grounds of religion, of sex, of race, could devise a similar scheme to Stonewall. And you might think, well, why not? But if you were then in a position where you had different religious institutions marking public sector organisations on how well they felt that they were representing their interests, how do you end up managing the interests of both a religious organisation and Stonewall and all those different religious organisations? And you can see how this could very quickly get out of control if all of those different lobbies and interests has essentially a seat at the table by being inside these organisations and being able to influence the policies of those organisations.
In the next episode, we talk to the UK's first non-binary mayor.
I think it's a shambles that Parliament have decided that they can't be bothered to respect non-binary people enough to accept our gender as legal and allow us to place it on our legal documentation. I think that's a huge failing of Parliament.